You don't belong in here." The words cracked through the quiet like a gunshot. A few heads turned. A couple stopped mid-sip of champagne. Somewhere near the window, a leather briefcase snapped shut. The man who had spoken stood tall behind the marble concierge desk, jaw tight, eyes sharp with irritation. Bradley Whitmore had been managing the Ether Lounge at Teterboro Airport for almost 15 years. Long enough to recognize wealth the way a rancher recognizes horses by silhouette alone. Long enough to believe he could smell imposters from across the room. And right now, one of them was sitting in his lounge. Bradley's gaze locked on the man in the corner. Grey hoodie. Faded, wrinkled, sweatpants, mud on the shoes. The man sat quietly in a deep leather armchair beneath a tall fiddle-leaf fig plant, shoulders slumped, head tilted back, eyes closed. He looked like someone who had wandered in from the rain, not someone who paid $50,000 a year for landing rights. Bradley leaned toward the receptionist beside him. "Tyler," he muttered. The young receptionist looked up from the glowing monitor. "Yes, sir." Bradley tilted his chin toward the corner. "You see him?" Tyler followed the line of sight. "Oh, the guy in the hoodie?" Bradley's lip curled. "Exactly." Tyler squinted. "Maybe he's with that rapper's entourage," he said carefully, nodding toward the far side of the lounge where a famous hip-hop artist was arguing loudly on the phone. Bradley exhaled sharply through his nose. "Assume nothing," he said. His eyes drifted back to the man in the chair. "Look at him. Mud on the shoes, wrinkled hoodie, hair slightly damp, like he'd walked through the storm outside. He looks like he slept in a bus station." Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "Well, he came through the VIP side door." The sensor opened automatically. Bradley's jaw tightened. "That door opens for people whose jets are already on approach." He straightened his cufflinks slowly, which means one of two things happened. Tyler waited. Bradley's voice dropped. Either the system glitched, or someone walked in where they didn't belong. Across the lounge, the man in the hoodie shifted slightly in his chair. A waitress approached quietly, balancing a tray. Her name tag read, Emily Parker. 26, new employee, still nervous around the wealthy regulars. She stopped beside the chair. "Sir?" The man opened one eye, slowly, like someone waking from a dream he didn't have time for. "Yeah?" His voice was rough. "Tired." "You look like you could use some coffee," Emily said gently. "Can I bring you some?" The man blinked once, then nodded. "Black. Strong." Emily smiled softly. "Coming right up." As she walked away, Bradley watched the exchange with growing disgust. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Tyler glanced sideways. "What?" Bradley nodded toward Emily. "She's serving him." Tyler shrugged. "Maybe he's a client." Bradley let out a short laugh. "That man," he said. His voice carried a quiet venom. "I've seen every billionaire that walks through this lounge." His eyes hardened. "That one isn't one of them." Across the room, the man in the hoodie rubbed his face slowly with both hands. Ethan Caldwell, 36 years old, founder of Caldwell Systems, the quiet architect behind some of the most powerful digital infrastructure in North America. If Ethan flipped a switch in his server network tonight, half the financial trading platforms on Wall Street would freeze before sunrise. But right now, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Because he hadn't. 48 hours earlier, he'd been sitting in a windowless warehouse in Newark, negotiating a deal so secret even his own board didn't know the details. $3 billion. A logistics network acquisition that would triple the reach of Caldwell Systems. The papers had been signed just before dawn. By the time he stepped outside, the adrenaline was gone. Only exhaustion remained. So Ethan had done something he rarely allowed himself. He had taken a walk, just a quiet hike in the woods outside the city to clear his head before his pilot arrived. That explained the mud on the shoes, the hoodie, the tired eyes. It did not explain the storm brewing across the lounge. Bradley Whitmore stepped out from behind the desk. His shoes clicked sharply across the marble floor. Conversations dimmed as he walked. Some guests glanced up. Others pretended not to watch. Bradley enjoyed moments like this. Order needed to be maintained. Standards protected. He stopped directly in front of the chair. The man hadn't noticed him yet. Bradley looked down with open contempt. "Sir." No response. Bradley's voice grew louder. "Sir." Ethan opened his eyes slowly. The first thing he saw was a belt buckle, then a navy tie, then the tight, irritated face of Bradley Whitmore. "Yes?" Bradley folded his hands behind his back. "This is a private aviation lounge." Ethan blinked once. "I know." Bradley tilted his head. "Then you'll also know it's restricted to authorized clients." Ethan studied him for a moment. Calm, expression unreadable. "I am a client." A couple nearby guests turned their heads. Bradley laughed. Short. Dry. "You are." Ethan nodded slightly. "My plane is landing shortly." Bradley's smile vanished. "What's the name?" "Caldwell." Bradley didn't even hesitate. "There is no Caldwell arriving today." Ethan leaned back in the chair again. "Check the manifest." Bradley's eyes hardened. "I already did." A few feet away, Martin Doyle lowered his glass of scotch and watched with growing amusement. The rapper by the window stopped pacing. The room could feel the tension rising like pressure before a thunderclap. Bradley leaned closer. His voice dropped to a whisper that was still loud enough for half the lounge to hear. "You don't belong here." Silence spread across the room. Ethan looked up at him again. This time his eyes were clearer, colder, but his voice stayed calm. "You're making a mistake." Bradley straightened slowly. "No," he said. His finger pointed toward the glass doors where rain lashed against the runway. "The mistake," Bradley said quietly, "was letting you in." The rain slammed harder against the glass. Wind rattled the tall windows of the lounge like fingers tapping impatiently on a coffin lid. Outside, the runway lights glowed dull orange through the storm, long blurred streaks across wet pavement. Inside, no one spoke. Every eye had shifted to the man in the grey hoodie. Ethan Caldwell sat still for a moment longer, looking up at Bradley Whitmore as if measuring the weight of the moment. His face revealed nothing. No anger, no embarrassment. Just a quiet, steady calm that made the silence in the room feel heavier. Across the lounge, Martin Doyle leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He was 61, hedge fund money, a man who had built a career spotting weakness before others did. And what he saw in front of him now looked like weakness. "Well?" Martin said loudly, raising an eyebrow toward Bradley. "You going to let him set up camp here all night?" A few chuckles spread around the room. Bradley didn't smile. His eyes stayed locked on Ethan. "Sir," he said, voice colder now, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Stand up." Ethan's fingers rested loosely on the armrests of the chair. His hoodie sleeve was damp near the cuff, rainwater darkening the fabric. "I told you," Ethan said quietly. "I'm waiting for my aircraft." Bradley exhaled sharply through his nose. "You're not waiting for anything here." He leaned closer. "This is not a public terminal." The words came out slowly, measured, like a teacher explaining something painfully obvious to a child. "Drivers don't wait here. Couriers don't wait here. And whoever you are," his eyes dragged deliberately over the hoodie again, "you definitely don't wait here." A ripple of laughter moved through the lounge. Not loud, but enough. Ethan heard it. He looked around the room for the first time since Bradley approached. The rapper near the window had lowered his phone, watching like someone observing a street performance. A pair of venture capitalists whispered to each other near the bar. Martin Doyle lifted his glass slightly, like a man enjoying the first act of a play. Only one person looked uncomfortable. Emily Parker. She stood halfway between the bar and Ethan's chair, the untouched cup of coffee trembling slightly on her tray. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. Bradley didn't look at her. "Not now, Emily." Her lips pressed together. "But he asked for—" Bradley's voice snapped like a whip. "I said not now." The tray rattled softly in her hands. Ethan noticed. His gaze shifted briefly to her, then back to Bradley. "You should let her bring the coffee," Ethan said calmly. The room went still again. Bradley blinked once, then laughed. A harsh sound. "Oh, that's good." He turned halfway toward the watching guests, spreading his hands slightly. "You hear that?" His voice rose just enough to invite an audience. "The man who broke into the lounge is now giving staff instructions." Martin Doyle chuckled. Bradley looked back down at Ethan. "Let me make this very simple for you." His finger pointed toward the exit doors again. "You are leaving." Ethan didn't move. The rain hammered the glass harder. Outside, thunder rolled low across the dark sky above New Jersey. "I'm not leaving," Ethan said. His voice was still calm. That seemed to irritate Bradley more than anything. Bradley stepped closer until Ethan could smell the sharp scent of cologne and polished leather. "I can have airport police here in less than 3 minutes." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm sure you can." Bradley's jaw tightened. "And when they arrive," he continued, "they will escort you off this property." A pause. "Physically, if necessary." Another small laugh came from the bar. Someone whispered, "About time." Emily stood frozen. The coffee was starting to cool in the cup. Ethan looked at Bradley for a long moment. Then he slowly leaned forward and stood up. He was taller than Bradley expected. 6'2", broad shoulders beneath the damp hoodie. For half a second, Bradley took a small step backward before he caught himself. Ethan noticed that, too. "You're making an expensive mistake," Ethan said quietly. Bradley's eyes flashed. "Oh, I doubt that." He gestured toward the door again. "Out." Martin Doyle raised his glass again. "Escort him out the service entrance," he said lazily. "No need to parade him past the real clients." Another ripple of laughter. Ethan picked up his duffel bag from beside the chair. The zipper clinked softly against the metal frame as he lifted it. No one moved to help him. No one stopped him. Emily took a small step forward. "Sir, your coffee." Bradley's voice cut across the room. "Emily." She froze again. "Take it back." Her face flushed. "But he's not a customer." The words landed hard. Emily lowered the tray slowly. Ethan watched the moment quietly. Then he gave her a small nod. "It's all right," he said. She swallowed. Ethan walked toward the glass doors. The entire lounge watched him go. His shoes left faint, damp marks across the polished floor. Bradley followed a few steps behind, making sure the path stayed clear. Just before Ethan reached the door, Martin Doyle's voice drifted across the room. "Nice shoes, pal." A few heads turned. Martin smirked. "Salvation Army having a sale?" Laughter again. This time louder. Ethan didn't react. He stepped through the sliding glass doors. The storm hit him instantly. Cold rain whipped sideways under the overhang, soaking his sweatpants in seconds. The wind carried the smell of jet fuel and wet asphalt. Behind him, the doors slid shut with a quiet mechanical hiss. Inside the lounge, Bradley Whitmore straightened his tie. The room buzzed again with low conversation. The tension had broken. Martin Doyle leaned back in his chair, pleased with the evening's entertainment. Bradley walked back toward the concierge desk, smoothing the sleeves of his expensive suit. "Well handled," Martin said, raising his glass slightly. Bradley allowed himself a thin smile. "Standards matter." Tyler glanced nervously toward the glass. Through the rain, Ethan Caldwell was still standing there, just beyond the curb, getting soaked. Tyler hesitated. "Should we call security anyway?" Bradley shook his head. "No need." He adjusted his cufflinks. "He'll leave." Outside, Ethan wiped rainwater from his face. Water dripped from the edge of his hoodie. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen glowed in the darkness. "Captain Marcus Reed," Ethan answered. "Marcus?" The pilot's voice came through the speaker, calm and professional. "Mr. Caldwell, we're on final approach." A low rumble rolled across the distant runway. "We'll be on the ground in about 6 minutes." Marcus paused. "You inside the lounge?" Ethan glanced through the glass. Inside, Bradley Whitmore was pouring champagne for Martin Doyle. Everyone looked relaxed again. Comfortable. Certain they had restored order. Ethan looked back at the rain. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not in the lounge." A pause on the line. "You're not?" Ethan watched Bradley laughing inside. "I've been evicted." The silence on the other end of the call lasted almost 5 seconds. Then Marcus Reed spoke again, but his voice had changed. Evicted? Ethan leaned against the wet metal railing. The terminal manager thinks I'm a vagrant. Inside the lounge, Martin Doyle raised another toast. Bradley Whitmore smiled. Outside, Ethan Caldwell stood alone in the storm and waited. Marcus Reed did not answer immediately. Inside the cockpit of the approaching jet, the rain hammered the windshield in thick sheets, the runway lights of Teterboro glowing through the storm like distant embers. The aircraft sliced through low clouds, engines humming with quiet precision. Marcus had been flying private aircraft for nearly 25 years. Before that, he had flown combat missions for the Air Force. He had heard every kind of request a billionaire could make. But this one was different. Evicted, Marcus repeated slowly. Ethan leaned against the cold metal railing outside the terminal, rain sliding down his neck beneath the hoodie. The storm had turned the pavement into a mirror of trembling lights. That's right, Ethan said calmly. Apparently I don't meet the dress code. Marcus glanced toward his co-pilot, a younger man named Chris Dalton, who was scanning instruments across the illuminated control panel. Chris noticed the look. What's going on? Marcus muted the mic for a moment. Boss got thrown out of the lounge. Chris blinked. You're kidding. Marcus unmuted the line. You want me to call airport authority? He asked. No, Ethan said. Rain drummed harder against the metal canopy above him. Inside the lounge, Bradley Whitmore laughed at something Martin Doyle had said. Champagne flutes clinked. The warmth of the room glowed through the glass like a distant world. Ethan watched them. I want you to do something else. Marcus leaned forward slightly in his seat. What's that? Make an entrance. Chris glanced sideways. Marcus lifted one eyebrow. Define entrance. Ethan's voice stayed steady. You're assigned runway 19, right? That's correct. That taxi route brings you past the terminal windows. Marcus understood immediately. A small grin crept onto his face. You want them to see the plane. I want them to feel it. Chris leaned closer, curious now. Ethan continued. Bring the aircraft straight to Gate 1. Marcus let out a short breath. That position is reserved for heads of state. I know. Marcus tapped the flight panel lightly. Ground control won't like that. I'll pay the fine. The rain outside intensified, wind whipping sideways across the runway. Marcus looked ahead through the storm. How close? Ethan turned his eyes toward the glass doors. Inside, Bradley Whitmore was describing the incident with animated gestures, playing the hero of the moment. Close enough that the nose of the jet is staring him in the face. Marcus laughed quietly. Yes, sir. He glanced down at the call sign display. Kingpin 1 will be making a statement. Ethan wiped rainwater from his cheek. One more thing. Go ahead. Keep the engines spooled high when you taxi in. Chris chuckled softly beside Marcus. Going for dramatic effect? Marcus nodded. That's exactly what we're doing. Outside the lounge, Ethan ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He stood there in the rain without moving. 6 minutes. Inside the terminal, the mood had shifted back to comfort. Bradley Whitmore stood behind the marble desk once again, smoothing his tie with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had just defended the gates of elite society. Martin Doyle approached the desk, drink in hand. "You handled that well," Martin said. Bradley inclined his head slightly. "We maintain standards here." Martin nodded approvingly. "You let one person slip through and suddenly the place fills up with them." Tyler shifted behind the desk, typing nervously at his keyboard. Emily Parker walked past, carrying a tray of empty glasses. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the rain outside. Ethan Caldwell still stood there, soaked now, completely drenched. Her chest tightened. "He wasn't bothering anyone," she said quietly. Bradley didn't look at her. "Emily." "Yes, sir. You are paid to serve drinks." Her hands tightened around the tray. "Not offer charity?" Emily nodded and walked away. The lounge returned to its steady hum of quiet wealth. A hedge fund manager argued softly about Japanese markets. The rapper by the window had resumed pacing while speaking into his phone. Martin Doyle settled back into his chair. Bradley Whitmore allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. This was how things should be. Order maintained. Standards preserved. Then the radio behind the concierge desk crackled. It was normally just background noise, a low murmur from the airport control tower. But now the voice was sharp. "Urgent. All ground units clear taxiway, Alpha and Bravo immediately." Tyler frowned. "What?" The radio continued. "Priority heavy arrival inbound." Bradley turned slowly. "Priority?" Tyler typed quickly, pulling up the arrival schedule. "That's usually reserved for government aircraft." Bradley folded his arms. "Is Air Force One coming?" Tyler shook his head. "I don't see anything." The radio crackled again. "Aircraft call sign Kingpin 1 requesting direct taxi to Ether Terminal Gate 1. Bradley's brow furrowed. "Gate 1? Tyler stared at the screen. "That spot is usually for the Saudi prince's Boeing." Martin Doyle looked up from his chair. "What kind of aircraft is it?" The answer came through the radio seconds later. "Incoming aircraft is a Gulfstream 700. The room grew quiet. Someone near the bar whispered. "The 700? Another voice said softly. "That's the new one." Outside, the storm clouds shifted as something bright pierced the darkness. At first, it was just light. Then a low vibration rolled through the building. Glasses on the tables trembled. The sound deepened, a thunderous bass that vibrated through the marble floor. "What is that?" someone asked. The rapper walked to the window. Then his eyes widened. "Yo." Everyone turned. Through the rain-streaked glass, two blazing white landing lights cut through the storm. A massive silhouette descended from the dark sky. The Gulfstream 700 was the crown jewel of private aviation, $70 million of polished engineering and ruthless luxury. Its wings sliced through the rain like knives. The aircraft touched down with a roar that echoed across the tarmac. But it didn't slow the way most jets did. Instead, it accelerated down the taxiway, straight toward the terminal. Martin Doyle stood up. "Why is it coming this way?" Bradley's smile faded. "That pilot is coming in way too fast." The engines howled. Water sprayed across the runway, behind the jet like a tidal wave. Inside the lounge, several guests stepped away from the windows. "Is he trying to hit the building?" The jet turned sharply. Its nose pointed directly at the glass wall of the lounge. Bradley Whitmore froze. The massive aircraft thundered closer, closer, closer. Someone screamed. At the last possible second, the brakes slammed. The jet stopped with surgical precision, just feet from the glass. The heat from the engines fogged the windows instantly. The lounge fell into stunned silence. Outside in the rain, Ethan Caldwell pushed himself off the railing. The aircraft door began to open. Steam curled across the glass as the engines idled, a deep mechanical growl vibrating through the lounge floor. For several seconds, no one moved. The Gulfstream 700 sat there like a predator that had just chosen where to rest. Its nose pointed straight at the terminal windows, close enough that the reflection of the room shimmered across the aircraft's polished midnight blue surface. Bradley Whitmore felt the vibration in his ribs. The sound wasn't loud anymore, but it was powerful, steady, controlled. The kind of sound that belonged to machines, owned by people who never had to explain themselves. Martin Doyle stepped forward until his hand almost touched the glass. "That's a 700, he whispered, disbelief creeping into his voice. "I didn't think anyone had taken delivery yet." The rapper near the window pulled his phone up again, recording. "Man, this thing looks like a spaceship." Tyler stared at the aircraft tail, squinting through the fog on the window. "Who owns something like that?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter who owns it," he snapped. "That pilot just violated half a dozen safety rules." He grabbed the radio on the desk. "Security to Gate 1. Immediately. We've got a rogue aircraft approaching the terminal." His voice tried to sound confident, but there was tension underneath now. Outside, the aircraft door unlocked with a heavy metallic click. The built-in stairway began to descend, unfolding slowly through the rain. Each hydraulic movement echoed across the quiet tarmac. A flight attendant appeared in the doorway, dressed in a dark navy uniform that looked tailored rather than issued. Her hair was pulled back cleanly, posture straight, movements calm. She stepped onto the stairs carrying a large black umbrella. Instead of walking toward the terminal doors, she moved down the steps and stopped at the bottom, standing perfectly still. Waiting. Inside the lounge, confusion rippled across the room. "Why isn't the passenger getting off?" someone asked. Martin Doyle frowned. "That's strange." Bradley shoved past the crowd. "Move!" He pushed through the glass doors and stepped out under the overhang, rain mist blowing across the concrete. The cold wind hit his face instantly. Behind him, Martin followed, along with several curious guests who wanted a better view. Bradley marched toward the aircraft, pointing at the flight attendant. "You!" he shouted over the engine rumble. "Move this jet immediately. You are in violation of airport taxi protocol." The woman didn't react. Her eyes remained focused somewhere beyond Bradley's shoulder. Bradley waved the radio angrily. "Did you hear me?" Still nothing. The flight attendant simply stood there, umbrella ready, posture unchanged. Martin glanced behind them. "Bradley!" Bradley turned impatiently. "What?" Martin nodded toward the curb near the sidewalk. Bradley followed the direction with irritation first, then confusion. Through the rain, a figure was walking toward the aircraft. Grey hoodie, sweatpants soaked dark with rainwater. Mud on the shoes. Ethan Caldwell. Bradley's face hardened again instantly. "You again." He stepped forward, blocking Ethan's path. "I told you to leave the property." Ethan didn't slow. Rain ran down his face and dripped from the edge of his hood, he walked with quiet purpose toward the jet stairs. "Hey." Bradley stepped directly in front of him. "Where do you think you were going?" Ethan stopped just inches away. Up close, Bradley noticed something different now. The man's eyes were no longer tired. They were sharp, focused. "Move," Ethan said calmly. Bradley scoffed. "You're out of your mind. That aircraft is worth $70 million. Get away from it before security drags you off this runway." Behind Bradley, the flight attendant finally spoke. Her voice carried clearly over the rain. "Mr. Whitmore?" Bradley turned. "What?" Her expression remained composed, but the tone had shifted to something colder. "Please step aside." Bradley blinked. "Excuse me?" She gestured toward Ethan. "You are blocking Mr. Caldwell's path to his aircraft." The rain seemed to stop for a moment. Bradley looked back at Ethan, then at the jet, then at the woman. "His what?" The flight attendant's gaze didn't waver. "His aircraft," she repeated. "Mr. Caldwell is the owner of this jet, and he is ready to board." Martin Doyle's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the pavement. Tyler, still standing near the door, whispered something under his breath that no one heard. Bradley's mouth opened slightly. On the tail of the aircraft, the rain shifted just enough for the light to catch a symbol etched in silver. A stylized letter, C. The same logo printed on server maintenance contracts that the terminal signed every year. The same logo attached to one of the fastest-growing technology companies in North America, Caldwell Systems. Bradley's stomach dropped. Ethan stepped around him without another word. The flight attendant moved forward instantly, raising the umbrella over Ethan's head as he reached the stairs. "Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "Dry clothes are ready in the suite." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you, Olivia." He paused halfway up the steps and looked back over his shoulder. Bradley Whitmore stood in the rain, frozen. His expensive suit clung to him now, water dripping from the sleeves. The guests behind him stared with a mix of shock and sudden realization. Ethan's voice carried calmly through the storm. "Oh, and Bradley." Bradley flinched slightly at the sound of his name. "Yes?" Ethan's expression was calm, but his eyes had turned cold. "You mentioned earlier that you like to keep the riffraff out." Bradley said nothing. Ethan gestured back toward the terminal building with a small tilt of his head. "You might want to start packing your office." He climbed the rest of the stairs. The aircraft door closed with a heavy, sealed thud. Inside the lounge, silence spread like smoke. Outside, Bradley Whitmore remained standing in the rain as the engines of the Gulfstream 700 continued their steady, low growl, the sound echoing across the soaked runway, while realization slowly began to crush the confidence out of his chest. The aircraft door sealed with a solid metallic thud, and the roar of rain outside vanished as if someone had cut the world in half. Inside the cabin of the Gulfstream 700, the air was warm, quiet, and still. Soft amber lighting reflected off polished walnut panels and cream leather seats that looked more like a luxury penthouse than an aircraft interior. Water dripped from the hem of Ethan Caldwell's hoodie onto the hand-woven carpet beneath his feet. He stood there for a moment without speaking, just breathing. The silence felt unreal after the storm. Olivia Grant stepped forward immediately with a thick white towel. "Here, sir." Ethan took it and pressed it against his face. Warmth seeped into his skin, chasing away the cold that had settled into his bones while he stood outside in the rain. "Sorry about the carpet," he muttered behind the towel. Olivia shook her head gently. "The carpet can be replaced." Her voice lowered slightly. "Are you all right?" Ethan lowered the towel and nodded once. "I'm fine." A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. Just someone else's ego getting wet tonight. Olivia didn't ask more questions. She had worked for Ethan for 3 years and understood his rhythm. When he wanted to explain something, he would. When he didn't, silence was part of the job. She nodded toward the rear of the aircraft. "Your suite is ready. Dry clothes are laid out." Ethan glanced toward the cockpit door. "Where's Marcus?" "In the flight deck. He's holding position until you give the word." Ethan nodded. "Tell him to keep the engines idling." Olivia paused slightly. "Yes, sir. And turn on the exterior floodlights." She tilted her head. "You want the terminal illuminated?" Ethan looked toward the cabin windows. Through the rain-blurred glass, he could still see the lounge building glowing under the storm lights. "I want them to feel like they're standing in front of a stadium." Olivia smiled faintly. "I'll let him know." She moved forward toward the cockpit. Ethan walked toward the back of the jet. The interior stretched longer than most private aircraft cabins. 5 separate living areas, conference seating, a dining section, and at the rear, a private bedroom suite with a full shower. He pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of cedar and fresh linen. Inside the wardrobe hung several suits, perfectly pressed. Tom Ford, Brioni, Zegna. Ethan peeled the wet hoodie off slowly and tossed it into a hamper lined with cedar wood. Mud-stained sneakers followed. The exhaustion in his shoulders faded as he dressed. White shirt, dark navy 3-piece suit, black Oxford shoes polished to a mirror shine. When he stepped back toward the mirror mounted inside the suite door, the man staring back looked completely different. Sharp, focused, dangerously awake. The tired traveler from the lounge had disappeared. Ethan Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Systems, had returned. He walked back into the main cabin. Olivia was already setting up the large conference table. A rugged military-grade laptop sat open beside a steaming mug of Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee. Marcus Reed's voice drifted from the cockpit. "Lights are on." Outside, massive floodlights along the aircraft belly ignited at once. The storm outside the terminal suddenly glowed white. Inside the lounge, every guest turned toward the windows as the entire building lit up like a film set. Ethan sat down at the table. He didn't look out the window yet. He simply wrapped his hands around the coffee mug for a moment. Then he cracked his knuckles. "Olivia." "Yes, sir." "I need the secure line." She handed him a tablet connected to the aircraft's satellite network. "You're online." Ethan began typing. "Not checking emails. Not reviewing contracts." He was pulling up the corporate structure of Ether Aviation Holdings, the company that owned the terminal Bradley Whitmore worked for. Ether Aviation wasn't weak, but it was vulnerable. Their expansion into Dubai had overextended their credit lines. Stock had dropped 12% in the last quarter. Liquidity was tight. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair as he studied the numbers. $3 billion from the Red Line Logistics acquisition was still sitting in his holding accounts, untouched, waiting. He opened another window. Jonathan Vale, chairman of Ether Aviation. Ethan knew him casually from a golf club in the Hamptons. Vale never remembered Ethan's name, but he would tonight. Ethan tapped the call button. The video screen flickered. After a few seconds, a man in his early 60s appeared on the screen, sitting in a home office lined with dark bookshelves. Jonathan Vale looked irritated. "This is a private number." Ethan rested his elbow on the table. "Good evening, Jonathan." Vale frowned. "Who is this?" "Ethan Caldwell." Vale squinted. "Caldwell Systems?" "That's right." Vale leaned back slowly. "How did you get this number?" "I'm resourceful." Vale checked the clock behind him. "Mr. Caldwell, it's almost 7 in the evening. I'm having dinner with my wife." Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. "I don't think you'll want to wait until Monday." Vale sighed. "What is this about?" Ethan turned the laptop slightly so the cabin camera showed the window behind him. Through it, the illuminated terminal building was visible in the rain. "I'm currently parked outside your Teterboro executive lounge." Vale leaned forward. "Yes?" "I was just physically removed from your facility by your terminal manager." Vale blinked. "Removed?" He didn't like my hoodie. Vale's face changed instantly. "Oh." Ethan's voice remained calm. "I was thrown out into the rain in front of your clients." Vale rubbed his forehead. "That's unacceptable. I'll have him reprimanded immediately." "I don't want a reprimand." Vale paused. "Then what do you want?" Ethan tapped a key and pulled up Ether Aviation's debt structure. "I want the terminal." Vale stared at him. "I'm sorry. I want to buy the lease for the Teterboro facility." Vale laughed once. "That's $100 million asset. I'll pay a 20% premium." Vale's smile vanished. "Tonight." The room went quiet. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Or I'll spend the weekend shorting your stock and tweeting to 4 million followers that your company assaults tech founders in your lounge." Vale stared at him for several seconds. The rain hammered the aircraft windows outside. Finally, Vale spoke quietly. "You're serious?" Ethan nodded once. "Very." Vale exhaled slowly. "What's the condition?" Ethan's eyes darkened slightly. "I want full operational control immediately." Vale waited. "And?" Ethan glanced toward the glowing lounge building outside the window. "I want access to the lounge PA system." Vale's eyebrows lifted. "For what?" Ethan's voice stayed perfectly calm. "I'd like to introduce myself to my new employees." Jonathan Vale did not answer right away. The rain tapped against the windows of his office somewhere in Connecticut, but it sounded faint compared to the storm raging on the runway in New Jersey. He leaned back slowly in his chair, fingers pressed against his lips as he studied Ethan Caldwell through the screen. 20% premium, Vale said finally. "Yes. And you want operational control immediately?" "Yes." Vale looked down at the numbers Ethan had already pulled up on the shared document. The figures were correct. Painfully correct. The Dubai expansion had tied up too much capital. Ether Aviation needed liquidity, and they needed it quickly. "You understand," Vale said carefully, "that selling the terminal tonight would require board approval." Ethan sipped his coffee. "You are the board." Vale let out a small breath. You don't waste time, do you? Ethan didn't answer. The cabin lights reflected in the window beside him, the glowing outline of the lounge visible beyond the storm. Through the glass, figures moved back and forth like shadows in an aquarium. Vale glanced toward his own window, thinking. 20% premium, he repeated quietly. Cash, Ethan said. Immediate transfer. Vale picked up a pen from his desk and tapped it twice against the wood. And you want the PA system? Yes. Vale chuckled under his breath. You're planning something. Ethan leaned forward slightly. I'm planning accountability. Another pause stretched across the call. Vale finally nodded. Send the contract. Ethan tapped 2 keys. The encrypted document appeared instantly on Vale's screen. Vale scanned it quickly, eyes moving faster now. The room in Connecticut was silent, except for the faint scratching sound of the pen as he signed the digital authorization line. Done, Vale said. Ethan nodded once. Funds will hit escrow in 5 minutes. Vale looked back at him. You move fast, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan's voice remained calm. You should see how fast I move when I'm angry. Vale gave a small laugh. Well, he leaned back. The Teterboro terminal is yours. Ethan reached forward and ended the call. The cabin went quiet again. Olivia stood nearby, watching him carefully. Congratulations, she said softly. Ethan closed the laptop. This isn't about congratulations. Outside, the aircraft floodlights continued blasting white light across the storm-soaked terminal building. Inside the lounge, Bradley Whitmore stood dripping wet near the window. His expensive suit clung awkwardly to his shoulders. Rainwater had flattened his carefully styled hair against his forehead. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of a swimming pool fully dressed. Martin Doyle stood nearby with a towel draped around his neck. You might want to dry off, Martin said. Bradley ignored him. His eyes were locked on the jet outside. That pilot is finished, Bradley muttered. I'm calling the FAA first thing tomorrow. Martin frowned slightly. Are you sure that's a good idea? Bradley turned sharply. What's that supposed to mean? Martin didn't answer right away. He had spent the last 10 minutes searching something on his phone. His face had changed, Bradley noticed. What? Martin looked up slowly. You really don't know who that is, do you? Bradley's stomach tightened. I don't care who he is. Martin shook his head. That's Ethan Caldwell. Bradley blinked. Who? Martin stared at him. Founder of Caldwell Systems. Bradley's mouth opened slightly. Martin continued quietly. They run half the cloud infrastructure used by the New York Stock Exchange. Bradley looked back toward the jet. That's impossible. Martin held up his phone. I just checked the aircraft registration. He turned the screen toward Bradley. The tail number was clearly visible. Registered under Caldwell Holdings. Bradley's face drained of color. But he was wearing a hoodie, Martin finished. That's what tech billionaires wear. The room had grown quieter now. Several guests had overheard the conversation. The rapper lowered his sunglasses slowly. You're telling me that guy is worth billions? Martin nodded. About 18 billion, last time I checked. Bradley's knees felt slightly weak. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. I need to fix this. Martin watched him carefully. Fix what? Bradley grabbed a towel from the counter and wiped rainwater from his face. "I'll apologize." Martin didn't move. Bradley turned toward the doors. It was a misunderstanding. He pushed through the glass doors again and stepped back into the storm. The wind hit him immediately. He walked toward the aircraft quickly, shoulders tense. But he stopped halfway. The floodlights mounted under the jet suddenly brightened, blinding. The entire front of the terminal glowed like a stadium. Inside the lounge, several guests shielded their eyes. "What the hell is he doing?" someone whispered. Bradley squinted toward the aircraft. Then every screen inside the lounge flickered. The television over the bar went black. The digital flight display panels shut off. Even the Wi-Fi router lights on the wall blinked out. Tyler looked down at his computer. "My system just died." Emily pulled out her phone. No signal. Martin checked his own. Mine too. The room filled with uneasy murmurs. "What's happening?" Bradley turned back toward the building. Inside, the giant central monitor mounted above the bar flickered back to life. But it wasn't showing the news anymore. It showed the interior of a private jet. Cream leather seats, polished walnut table, and sitting at the head of the table wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit was Ethan Caldwell. He looked directly into the camera, which meant he was looking directly into the lounge. Bradley froze in the rain. Inside, the speakers crackled once. Then Ethan's voice filled the entire room. "Good evening." Every conversation stopped. Glasses hovered halfway to lips. Emily Parker stood frozen beside the bar. Ethan rested his hands calmly on the table. "My name is Ethan Caldwell." He paused. "Some of you may remember me as the man in the hoodie who was asked to wait outside 20 minutes ago." No one laughed now. The room was silent. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I had a fascinating conversation with your terminal manager tonight." The camera zoomed just enough to tighten the frame. He explained that this lounge was reserved for the owners of the world. A small smile touched Ethan's face, and he was absolutely right. Bradley Whitmore felt the blood drain from his body. Ethan reached down and lifted a tablet from the table. The contract glowed on the screen. So I took his advice. Ethan held the tablet up for the camera. As of 3 minutes ago, he paused just long enough for every person in the lounge to feel the weight of the moment. I became one of the owners. Gasps rippled across the lounge. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, like the floor itself had shifted under everyone's feet. The giant screen over the bar glowed with the image of Ethan Caldwell, seated calmly inside the cabin of the Gulfstream 700. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the lounge, every sound had died. Martin Doyle lowered his glass slowly. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. Behind the bar, Emily Parker's hands trembled slightly as she set a tray down on the counter. Tyler stared at the screen, his mouth half open. Bradley Whitmore stood outside in the rain, staring through the glass doors as Ethan's voice continued through the lounge speakers. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting lightly on the polished table in front of him. "As of 3 minutes ago," he said calmly, I purchased the controlling lease of the Ether Executive Terminal at Teterboro. The room remained silent. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying the camera. That means, he continued, that I am now the landlord of the building you are currently standing in. The weight of the words settled slowly across the room like fog. Martin Doyle blinked. You bought the terminal, he murmured. The rapper by the window lowered his phone slightly, stunned. On the screen, Ethan's expression hardened just a little. And that means, he said, voice calm but colder now, that every employee currently working in this facility works for me. Outside, Bradley Whitmore felt his stomach drop. Rain ran down the side of his face. He suddenly realized he was shaking. Inside the lounge, Ethan's eyes moved slightly, as if scanning the room through unseen cameras. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. Bradley froze. The speakers carried Ethan's voice through the storm. "I know you can hear me." Several guests turned toward the doors where Bradley stood. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I can see you through the security feed." Bradley's throat tightened. "You look wet." A few uncomfortable glances passed between the guests. Ethan continued calmly. "It's unpleasant standing in the rain, isn't it?" Bradley pushed through the glass doors and stepped inside quickly, water dripping onto the marble floor. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, voice shaky. The entire lounge turned toward him. On the screen, Ethan's expression didn't change. "Yes, Bradley." The fact that he used his first name hit Bradley like a slap. Bradley swallowed. I didn't know who you were." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "That's correct." Bradley forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If I had known, you would have treated me differently." Bradley hesitated. "Yes." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's exactly the problem." Silence filled the room again. Ethan rested his hands on the table. "You judged a person based on how they looked." His voice was still calm, but the edge in it had sharpened. You assumed exhaustion meant weakness. You assumed simplicity meant poverty. You assumed someone wearing a hoodie couldn't possibly own anything. Bradley felt heat rise into his face. Around him, the guests avoided eye contact. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "In my business," he said quietly, "that kind of judgment error costs companies billions." He tapped a key on the laptop in front of him. "I've already reviewed your employment file." Bradley blinked. "My what?" Ethan's voice continued. "Multiple complaints from junior staff, 3 HR warnings, 2 reports of withheld tips from catering employees." Bradley's face turned pale. My servers don't lie," Ethan said calmly. The words hit like a hammer. Ethan looked directly into the camera. "Bradley Whitmore." The room held its breath. "You are terminated." Bradley staggered back slightly. "Effective immediately." The speakers carried every word clearly through the lounge. "For cause." Bradley shook his head. "You can't." Ethan raised one hand slightly. "Yes, I can." Another heavy silence fell over the room. But Ethan wasn't finished. "However," he said, slowly, "simply firing you doesn't seem like enough of a lesson." Bradley's heart pounded. Ethan leaned back in his chair again. You told me earlier that riffraff should use the service door. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's voice remained steady. So we're going to follow your rules. He glanced slightly off camera. Security. The lounge doors opened. 2 large men stepped inside. They wore dark, tactical jackets and moved with the quiet confidence of professionals who didn't ask questions. Bradley stared at them. Who are they? Ethan answered calmly. My security team. The guards walked directly toward Bradley. Bradley raised his hands defensively. Wait. One of the guards took his arm. Bradley struggled slightly. You can't do this. The second guard stepped beside him. We know exactly who we're doing this to, the man said quietly. You're the guy who just got fired by the owner. A few guests quietly stepped out of the way as the guards began escorting Bradley toward the back hallway. Bradley looked around desperately. Martin. Martin Doyle didn't move. Bradley turned toward Emily. She stood frozen behind the bar. No one spoke. The guards pulled Bradley towards the kitchen doors. Wait, Bradley shouted. It's pouring outside. One of the guards opened the service door. Cold rain blasted into the hallway instantly. You can wait on the public sidewalk, he said calmly, just like you told Mr. Caldwell earlier. The guards shoved Bradley through the doorway. The door slammed shut behind him. The rain swallowed his shouting almost instantly. Inside the lounge, the silence was absolute. On the screen, Ethan Caldwell watched quietly for a moment. Then his expression softened slightly. Now, he said calmly, to the rest of you. Several guests shifted nervously. I apologize for the inconvenience this evening. He lifted his coffee mug and took a slow sip. To make up for the disturbance, he continued, fuel and landing fees for all aircraft currently here tonight will be covered by me. Murmurs spread through the room. That alone represented tens of thousands of dollars. But Ethan wasn't finished. One more personnel change. He glanced toward the security camera feed again. Is Emily Parker still there? Emily froze. Several guests turned toward her. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Yes, sir. Ethan smiled slightly. I saw you try to bring me coffee earlier. Emily blinked. You treated someone with respect when you believed they had nothing. She felt her throat tighten. That matters. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Emily Parker. Her heart pounded. As of this moment, you are the new terminal manager. The tray slipped from her hands and clattered onto the marble floor. The tray hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic crash that echoed across the lounge. Emily Parker stared at the screen as if the words had not yet fully reached her brain. Her hands hovered in the air where the tray had been, fingers trembling slightly. Me? She whispered. Every eye in the room had turned toward her. On the screen, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, watching her reaction calmly. The storm outside still roared against the glass walls, but inside the lounge, no one seemed to hear it anymore. Yes, Ethan said. Emily shook her head slightly. I'm just a waitress. Her voice was barely steady. I don't know how to run a terminal. A few guests shifted in their seats. Martin Doyle crossed his arms, studying the scene carefully. Ethan rested his hands on the table in front of him. You know how to treat people, he said. That's the part most managers fail. Emily's eyes stung. You showed empathy, Ethan continued. You showed respect. He glanced down briefly at something on his laptop screen. The logistics can be taught. He looked back up. Character cannot. Emily swallowed hard. Her voice cracked slightly. Thank you. Ethan gave a small nod. My operations team will arrive Monday morning. They'll help you transition. He paused for a moment. Your salary will triple. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. You'll have full benefits, and your first responsibility, Ethan continued calmly, is to rebuild this staff. Emily blinked. Rebuild? Ethan nodded once. I want people who understand that respect isn't determined by clothing or bank accounts. He leaned back again. Everyone gets treated like a human being here. The rapper near the window clapped once, loudly. That's what I'm talking about. A few others followed with hesitant applause. Martin Doyle didn't clap. He simply watched Emily closely. Ethan looked across the lounge through the camera. And to everyone else here tonight, his voice softened slightly. I hope this was educational. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Ethan continued calmly. The most dangerous mistake in business is assuming you know someone's value just by looking at them. He glanced briefly toward the doors where Bradley had been dragged out minutes earlier. Arrogance is expensive. Then he smiled slightly. And tonight, someone else paid the bill. The screen flickered for a moment. The video feed cut. Instantly, the lounge lights brightened back to their normal level. The Wi-Fi routers hummed back to life. Phones began buzzing across the room as signals returned. Outside, the engines of the Gulfstream 700 roared louder as Marcus Reed began preparing for departure. The jet slowly rolled away from the terminal window. Guests moved toward the glass, watching. The massive aircraft turned gracefully across the rain-soaked taxiway. Its lights cut through the storm like blades. Inside the lounge, the mood had changed completely. The air felt different, less stiff, less guarded. Emily stood frozen behind the bar for another moment before Tyler rushed over. Emily, manager? She let out a shaky breath. I guess so. Tyler grinned nervously. Congratulations. Emily looked around the lounge slowly. The same room that had felt intimidating just an hour ago now looked different somehow, more human. Martin Doyle approached the bar slowly. Emily straightened slightly. Mr. Doyle. Martin studied her carefully. Miss Parker. He paused for a moment. You handled yourself well. Emily gave a small nod. Thank you. Martin glanced toward the runway outside, where the jet was now accelerating through the storm. You know, he said quietly, I've met Ethan Caldwell before. Emily raised an eyebrow. You have? Once? Martin slipped his hands into his coat pockets. 3 years ago, at a tech conference in San Francisco. Emily waited. Martin smiled faintly. He was wearing the same hoodie. She couldn't help but laugh softly. That seems to be his style. Martin nodded. He does it on purpose. Emily frowned slightly. Why? Martin looked toward the runway again. Because the way people treat you when they think you're nobody. He paused. Tells you exactly who they really are. Outside the Gulf Stream. 700 lifted off the wet runway, engines screaming into the stormy sky. The jet disappeared into the clouds within seconds. Inside the lounge, Emily leaned against the bar and took a long breath. Her heart was still racing. She looked down at the shattered tray on the floor. Tyler crouched and began picking up the pieces. "You're going to need a new tray," he said. Emily smiled slightly. "I think the budget can handle it." Across the room, several guests returned to their seats. But the atmosphere was completely different now. The stiffness was gone. The invisible hierarchy that had filled the room earlier had cracked. Emily walked slowly toward the large window. Rain streaked down the glass. Somewhere out there, Bradley Whitmore was standing on a dark sidewalk in the storm. She felt a strange mix of sympathy and justice. Behind her, Tyler called out. "Manager Parker," she turned. "Yes?" He held up a tablet. "The system is asking for the new manager's login." Emily hesitated for half a second. Then she walked back towards the desk. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed slowly. "Emily Parker. Manager." The system accepted the entry instantly. Across the screen, the terminal operations dashboard lit up. Dozens of aircraft schedules, fuel logs, staff rosters. For the first time in her life, the entire building was under her responsibility. Emily exhaled slowly. Then she turned to Tyler. "First change." He straightened. "Yes, ma'am." Emily glanced toward the coffee machine. "Pilots don't pay for coffee anymore." Tyler blinked. "That's the first rule?" Emily nodded. "If someone's flying a $50 million aircraft across the country." She smiled slightly. "We can afford to treat them like guests." Tyler grinned. "Yes, ma'am." Emily looked around the lounge again. The storm outside was already beginning to calm, and for the first time that night, the room finally felt warm. The rain had slowed to a cold drizzle by the time Bradley Whitmore reached the highway overpass. 3 miles. That was how far he had walked. His Italian leather shoes, the ones he used to polish every Sunday morning, were ruined now. The soles peeled slightly from the wet pavement, and every step made a soft, squelching sound that echoed under the concrete bridge. Cars rushed past on the highway above him, tires humming against wet asphalt. Bradley's shoulders hunched against the cold wind. His phone had died somewhere during the walk. The battery had blinked red just as he tried to order a ride. He hadn't even realized how far the terminal was from the main road. He had never needed to know. People like him didn't walk. They drove. They managed. They controlled. Now he stood beneath a flickering streetlight, water dripping from his hair into the collar of his shirt, staring at the yellow glow of a small 24-hour diner across the road. The sign buzzed softly in the mist. "Diner open all night." Bradley crossed the street slowly. The door chimed when he stepped inside. Warm air hit him instantly. The diner smelled like coffee and grease and fried onions. A tired waitress behind the counter glanced up. She was older than Emily Parker, maybe in her late 50s, with grey hair pulled into a loose bun and deep lines around her eyes that suggested decades of night shifts and early mornings. She looked Bradley up and down. Wetsuit, expensive cufflinks, mud on the shoes. A man who clearly didn't belong in a place like this. "What'll it be?" she said flatly. Bradley's throat felt dry. "Coffee," he said. His voice sounded smaller than he expected. "And do you have a phone charger?" She jerked her thumb toward the wall behind the counter. $5 to use the outlet." Bradley reached into his pocket automatically, then froze. His wallet wasn't there. It was still sitting in the desk drawer of his office at the terminal, the office he had been banned from less than an hour earlier. His fingers searched the other pockets. Nothing. No cash, no cards, no ID, just a soaked suit and a dead phone. Bradley swallowed. "I can't pay right now." The waitress stared at him. For a moment her eyes softened slightly. Then the softness disappeared. "No money," she said. "Coffee." Bradley's shoulders sagged. "Please," he said quietly. "I just need to charge my phone." She pointed toward the door. "There's a payphone outside." Bradley turned slowly. The bell chimed again as he stepped back out into the cold night. The drizzle had nearly stopped. The broken payphone stood beside the diner wall, its metal casing rusted and scratched. Bradley stared at it. The receiver hung loosely from a twisted cord. He laughed once. A hollow sound. Of course it didn't work. He leaned against the brick wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to manage. No employees, no authority, no office waiting for him in the morning. Just silence and the faint rumble of traffic above. Bradley Whitmore had spent his entire career deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now, he stood on the outside of everything. Exactly where he had put Ethan Caldwell. 3 weeks later, the storm had long passed over Teterboro. Autumn sunlight stretched across the runway, crisp and golden, carrying the smell of jet fuel and fallen leaves. The terminal building looked the same from the outside. Glass walls, steel frame, polished marble lobby. But inside, everything felt different. The sign above the entrance had changed. Caldwell Lounge. Inside the reception area, the atmosphere had shifted from quiet intimidation to something warmer. Guests still wore expensive suits and watches, but they spoke to the staff instead of through them. Emily Parker sat in the office that used to belong to Bradley Whitmore. The expensive abstract painting on the wall had been replaced by large whiteboards covered in flight schedules and staff notes. The mahogany desk still stood in the center of the room. But now it held training manuals and operational charts instead of bottles of imported scotch. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair while finishing a phone call. "No," she said calmly into the headset. "We're not charging pilots for coffee anymore." She listened. "Yes, I understand. It used to be policy." A pause. "Well, the policy changed." She smiled slightly. "If someone's flying a $50 million jet across the country, we can afford to give them an espresso." Another pause. "Thank you." She ended the call and rubbed her eyes briefly. Running the terminal had been exhausting, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. The door knocked softly. Emily looked up. "Come in." Tyler stepped inside. Except now his name tag read Concierge Lead. "You've got a visitor," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Tyler stepped aside. Martin Doyle walked in, slowly. He looked slightly uncomfortable. "Miss Parker." Emily stood up. "Mr. Doyle." Martin cleared his throat. "I just wanted to say, about that night?" Emily waited. Martin shifted his weight. "I shouldn't have laughed." Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Noted. Martin smiled awkwardly. "You're doing a good job here." Emily glanced around the office. "Revenue's up 15% already." Martin blinked. "Seriously?" She nodded. "Turns out, when you treat people like human beings—" She shrugged lightly. "They come back." Martin chuckled softly. "Well." He hesitated near the door. "Do you know what happened to Whitmore?" Emily looked down at the paperwork on her desk. "I believe he's pursuing other opportunities." Martin nodded slowly. "Right." He turned and left the office quietly. Across the city in a warehouse district of Newark, Bradley Whitmore sat in a metal chair in a small office filled with the smell of cardboard and diesel. A man in a safety vest sat behind the desk across from him. The man tapped a keyboard slowly. "So," the man said, "you used to manage a private aviation terminal?" Bradley nodded stiffly. "Yes." The man turned the monitor around. On the screen was a video clip. Bradley being dragged through the service door into the rain. The video had millions of views online. The caption read, "Manager throws out tech billionaire. Loses job 5 minutes later." The man leaned back in his chair. "We move freight here," he said. "We don't move billionaires." Bradley stared at the screen. "I've learned my lesson." The man studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "I can't hire you as supervisor." Bradley's shoulders sagged. "But we do need a night dispatcher." The man folded his arms. $18 an hour. Bradley closed his eyes briefly. 6 months earlier, he had spent that much on a single drink. Now he nodded slowly. "I'll take it." 6 months later, the autumn air over Teterboro carried a different kind of energy. The trees along the edge of the runway had turned deep shades of orange and copper, their leaves drifting across the taxiway like slow sparks in the afternoon wind. Jets still came and went with the same thunder they always had. But inside the terminal, something fundamental had shifted. The sign above the entrance now read, "Caldwell Lounge," in brushed steel letters that caught the sunlight. Inside, the atmosphere felt alert. Not quiet and intimidating the way it had been before, but active, warm, efficient. Staff moved with confidence instead of caution. Pilots laughed at the coffee bar while waiting for weather updates. Guests spoke to the employees by name. At the reception desk, Tyler adjusted his blazer and greeted a pair of arriving passengers with an easy smile. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds." They nodded warmly as they walked inside. Tyler glanced at the tablet on the desk, confirming the aircraft fueling schedule. 6 months earlier, he had been a nervous receptionist, trying not to upset Bradley Whitmore. Now he ran the entire concierge team. Across the lounge, the soft notes of a jazz trio drifted through the air. The musicians had been Emily's idea. "People travel better when the room breathes," she had told the staff during her second week as manager. It had worked. Business had surged. Private aviation forums online had started mentioning the terminal as the most comfortable stop in the Northeast. Word spread quickly among people who owned jets. Treat them like humans, and they returned. Emily Parker stood near the window overlooking the runway, tablet tucked under one arm, as she reviewed the evening departure schedule. Her posture had changed. 6 months of responsibility had sharpened her confidence. The once nervous waitress now moved through the terminal like someone who knew every system and every employee depended on her decisions. Tyler approached quietly. "He's landing in 3 minutes." Emily looked up. "Early again?" Tyler nodded. "Tailwind from Chicago." Emily smiled slightly. "Of course." Outside, a sleek black helicopter descended toward the helipad beside the terminal. The Airbus H-160 touched down smoothly, rotors chopping through the cool air before slowly winding down. Inside the lounge, a few guests glanced out the window. They recognized the aircraft. The door opened. Ethan Caldwell stepped out wearing a simple black t-shirt, dark jeans, and a backpack slung casually over one shoulder. No hoodie tonight. But nothing about his appearance suggested one of the most powerful technology executives in the country. He walked across the tarmac toward the terminal doors as the helicopter crew secured the aircraft behind him. Inside the glass doors slid open automatically. Tyler stepped forward immediately. "Welcome back, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan smiled and bumped fists with him lightly. "Good to see you, Tyler. How's the coding class?" Tyler grinned. "Still surviving it?" Ethan nodded approvingly. "Keep going. We'll need you at Caldwell Systems soon." Tyler's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir." Ethan walked through the lounge slowly, taking in the changes. The lighting felt warmer, the music softer. The staff moved naturally instead of stiffly. Guests looked relaxed. It felt like a place built for people rather than status. Emily approached from the window. "Boss?" Ethan smiled. "Manager Parker." She shook her head. "You're early." Wind helped. Ethan glanced around the room. "Place looks good." Emily handed him the tablet with the monthly numbers. "Revenue is up 18%. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Last time I checked it was 15. Emily shrugged. "Turns out treating people decently is profitable." Ethan chuckled softly. Strange concept. They walked together toward the coffee bar. A pilot in a flight jacket nodded to Emily. "Best espresso in Jersey." Emily pointed at Ethan. "His rule." The pilot laughed and returned to his seat. Ethan leaned against the counter. "Any issues lately?" Emily thought for a moment. "Nothing major." She hesitated slightly, although there was one package delivered earlier today. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small, plain envelope. No return address. Ethan opened it. Inside was a cashier's check, $4.50. Folded behind it was a small piece of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was uneven but careful. "Mr. Caldwell, I owe you for a coffee. I was arrogant, and I lost everything because of it. I am starting again from the bottom. The climb back up is long, but I understand something now. The view looks different from down here. Bradley Whitmore." Ethan folded the note quietly. Emily studied his expression. "You okay?" He slipped the paper into his pocket. "He's learning." Emily nodded slowly. "Do you want security to watch for him around the property?" Ethan shook his head. "No." He picked up his backpack. "Everyone deserves a chance to climb back up." Emily smiled faintly. "That sounds like you." Ethan glanced toward the runway where the Gulfstream 700 sat fueled and ready. The evening sky burned purple and gold behind it. Captain Marcus Reed stood near the stairs reviewing the pre-flight checklist. Ethan turned back toward the lounge one more time. Tyler was helping an elderly couple find their gate. The jazz trio had shifted into a slower melody. Guests were laughing quietly near the bar. The terminal no longer felt like a fortress built to keep people out. It felt like a place where people arrived. Ethan nodded once, satisfied. Then he stepped outside and walked toward the jet. The engines began to hum as Marcus started the systems. Ethan paused at the bottom of the stairs and glanced back at the glowing building one last time. 6 months earlier, that same building had thrown him into the rain because of a hoodie and a pair of muddy shoes. Now it stood as proof of something much bigger. Power was never about the suit someone wore. It was about what they built, what they owned, and most importantly, how they treated people when no one important was watching. Ethan climbed the stairs. The door sealed behind him. Moments later, the Gulf Stream rolled across the runway and lifted into the evening sky, disappearing above the clouds as the lights of Teterboro faded below. Stories like this remind us that the person someone laughs at today might be the one signing their paycheck tomorrow. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply waits for the moment when truth becomes impossible to ignore. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about quiet power and unexpected justice. And drop 3 words in the comments that describe what you felt while watching. Justice always wins.